Hi, Dan here. Hope you're doing really well. In this lesson, I'm going to give you 10 bass guitar tone tips. Now, the first one is hand placement and attack. So there are loads of different ways that you can play, but I'm just going to give you 3 now as a general guideline. Depending on what style you're playing, you can change these up within tunes as well. So first one is to play directly over the fretboard. Where the fretboard ends here, you get a nice soft sound. So if I just go, I don't know, for walking bass lines or ballads where you're playing long, gentle notes, you can get a nice soft tone there. Now, if you play closer to the bridge at the back here, I might solo or get a bit more of the bridge pickup going. I'm going to rest my thumb on the pickup at the back here, and you get a tighter, funkier, more percussive sound. Let's put the pickups back to where they were at the first example. For that kind of funky style of playing, the Jacko tone if you like, you can play closer to the bridge. Now somewhere in between the neck and the bridge, you can play rock styles really well there. So someone like, for example, Geddy Lee might play there, and this is where I might talk about attack. So I was plucking very gently in the other examples, maybe with the funk I was digging in a little bit more, but if you play right in the middle here, so I'm actually plucking a bit more into the direction of the body rather than just a normal rest stroke, coming from a bit of a greater height. And I just find that somewhere in the middle of the two extremes that I was showing you at the beginning, either here or here by the bridge, is a really good place to really dig in and good for rock tone. So experiment with that, with how hard you attack and where you pluck, and there's a whole spectrum of tones to be had between those two locations. Joe Osborne was a legendary bass player, part of the Wrecking Crew. He's played on loads of tunes. You've definitely heard millions of them before. And he used to play a jazz bass like this one. He had it strung with flat wounds. And this is a tip for anyone who has a 2 pickup bass, a bit like this. It doesn't have to be a Fender, just anything with 2 pickups. What he did, to simulate a bit more of the Fender precision tone, which is most players in those days, the session players, probably most of them were playing P basses, people like James Jameson and Carol Kane. And so what he did to get a bit closer to that tone was to use the flat wounds, which this hasn't got, but he soloed the front pickup and backed off the tone knob. So on a precision bass, you have 1 pickup, split coil pickup, somewhere about here where this neck pickup is. So what I'll do, I've turned the volume completely down now, so this neck pickup is completely off. I'll turn the tone completely off as well. Actually, let's start with how bass normally sounds. Look. Okay, back pickup completely off, tone completely off. So, whilst it doesn't sound exactly like a P bass, that is a really good way to get somewhere a bit closer. Okay, here are 2 muting techniques that you can use. So one is palm muting, where you do almost like a karate chop and you get this fleshy, fat side of your palm there. And put it right where the bridge is here. Not too hard. If you press down too hard and then you pluck, and you're going to be plucking, by the way, with your thumb, with that fleshy part of your thumb tip there. If you press down too hard, the note will choke, but just a little bit of pressure there. You get this really thuddy tone. It pokes out in the mix really well. It's great for simulating an upright. And if you're playing a bit faster, you can use your thumb, sort of like a downstroke like this. And then your index is an upstroke. So you get a really cool tone doing that. Another method you can use to mute is using Rocco Prestia's left-hand muting technique. Now, when he played a lot of the 16th note patterns that he used to do, because he's using fingerstyle and lots of 16th notes, lots of fast plucking. His plucking hand, his right hand, can't be involved in any of the muting. So what he used to do, let's for example play a D. I'm playing first finger, 5th fret of the A string, that's D. So you're fretting with the first finger, and then I'm just very lightly bringing down the 3rd and the 4th fingers onto that same string to mute it, just to touch that string really lightly. Not, again, not too much so as not to get any note like that. You can even flatten the fingers out. That's probably the way to do it, actually. Flatten the fingers out a bit more. And if you do that, it's a bit more where you have to shift a lot because you're just mainly fretting with the first 2 fingers. So 2 really great muting techniques there. Okay, next up is to think about bass tone going from dark to bright. Now, different styles of music will call on different tones. If you think about rock bass playing, you have generally, or a lot of the time anyway, you have stainless steel strings, sometimes played with a pick, if not a pick, played with an attack that sort of rattles the strings against the frets, a bit like that Geddy Lee tone I showed you before. And you have a spectrum going from that sort of bright tone all the way to a dark tone. So here's a hollow body bass. And that's really great for vintage styles. You know, you hear it on the neo-soul stuff with Pino Palladino, going back to that great album Voodoo. I think he brought back that sound into fashion, him and other players. Certain styles of music will lend themselves better to this idea of darker bass tones versus brighter bass tones. Now, I showed you those muting techniques, which is a good way of using your hands to alter technique. Well, actually, we did the placement of the hand and the attack. These are all ways that you can use your hands to alter the tone. But don't forget, this is an electric bass guitar, and pickups and electronics really play a big part as well. So just quickly want to talk about pickups. This is a Fender Jazz. It's got 2 pickups. Showed you that that trick where you can make it sound a bit more like a P bass at the front, or you can solo that back pickup and get both pickups. Front pickup. Now, a single pickup bass like a P bass, those basses are amazing. They're amazing for recording and playing live. Leo Fender got it right really early doors, and that design and that pickup style has been copied loads and loads of times. There's a clue there. It's good because people are used to it, and it has sounded amazing for decades. Now, like I said, people are used to that, but that P bass, it's less tonally versatile. The tone that it does fits in loads of situations, but it's not as versatile as, say, a jazz bass. So you get different pickup combinations. I've got a Stingray, I've got a couple of Stingrays that have got 1 humbucker. All these pickups sound a little bit different, but the configurations are all the same. You basically have P bass pickups, jazz bass pickups, Music Man pickups. Those are the main ones. Of course, you have plenty of others. You know, check out Curtis Novak. His site is amazing. He does bisonic pickups, loads of things like that that are a bit more specialized but sound incredible. So just work out the sounds that you like and that you need to create, and that will guide you a little bit towards what bass you might want to get for yourself. You can also modify basses to put different pickups in, and that will get you closer to the tone that you want. Sticking with the electric theme of the instruments, staying with the electric theme of the bass guitar, you have effects as well. So you don't have to use effects. Like, plenty of players just have the bass, cable, amp, and that's their setup. Modern bass players, it depends what you want to do, really. If you're in covers bands, then you probably will want a few effects to create a few of the famous tones. Here are a few. Active basses are powered by a battery. They have an internal preamp where you can control bass, treble, and sometimes mids. Now, this is completely personal preference, but you'll find a lot of session players will record with passive basses. Now, if you think about it from the producer or the mix engineer's point of view, you know, if you're a bass player and you come in, you've got all these effects pedals and fancy active, you know, EQ on your bass. What they want is just a really great bass tone straight up, but something that's usually anyway quite flat, because they will add EQ on in the mix. So that's how I do it when I record, and many people do it, is to just keep everything flat, and usually to use passive basses that just got a really simple straight up great tone, and then EQ and compression can be added in the mix. Now when live, I find that sometimes I like to have an active circuit on board to change the EQ on the fly without having to go to the amp. I think that's a really good way to go. So passive, active basses, you need to think about what your needs are. I play with a Stingray 5 a lot live, and that's just active. It doesn't have a push-pull knob like my other 5-string does. And that bass is a bit more tonally versatile because I can make it passive, or I can switch it in, the active circuit in, and then use the tone. There's no wrong or right, there's no better or worse here. You know, some people will swear by the sound of passive basses, and some people like the tonal versatility of the active bass. I would suggest, if you do have an active bass or are thinking about getting one, to get the one with the push-pull knob. I find that really, really versatile. You see a lot of debate in bass forums about using a plectrum or slapping and whether that's good and whether you should actually use your fingers, but I would suggest to leave that debate at the door and actually think about those 3 different styles as being able to produce the different tones. So everything in the lesson so far I've shown you fingerstyle, the different attack and the different placement. Now slap. You can hear that that's a different tone. It's like you're drumming and now the plectrum, obviously, it's made of a different material to your flesh. It's going to sound different. So this is a plastic one. You can get metal, you can get leather, you can get all different types, and it's going to sound different to your fingers. Now again, you can play with a pick in a very funky way like Bobby Vega, or you can play in a very rocky way like Billy Gould from Faith No More. There are so many different things you can do, and combine it with different strings, different pickups, and you know the effects I was talking about earlier, and you can actually start to create hundreds of different tones on the bass. All an EQ does is just act as a volume knob for certain frequencies. And I would advise to just have at least a passing knowledge of how to use one. Now, most bass players live and in the studio will go pretty flat with EQ, or maybe I shouldn't say most, at least I do. And as I mentioned before, if I've got an active bass, I can bump up especially the bass knob a little bit. If you're going for a Marcus Miller slap style tone, what he does is he boosts the treble and he boosts the bass, and that's really great for the thumping and the slapping sound. An EQ pedal is a great thing to consider for your pedal board, especially if you've got something like this, a passive bass where I can't tweak any EQ on board because it's a passive bass, not an active one. You can get an EQ pedal and you can bump up the lows, and say if you're doing some sort of reggae thing, you can use your palm muting, but kick on that pedal as well, and you've suddenly got this really deep, dubby tone. Also, EQ pedals are really, really good because certain pedals respond to certain frequencies. So you might have a vintage pedal and you might feel that it needs a few more mids, and you can boost some mids on your EQ pedal. That goes into the envelope, for example, and that sounds really cool. On an amp, if you're on a gig, I find that it's not very helpful having to turn around and go to the amp and change your settings all the time. That's why your pedal board could be good for that. But know at least what to do with that. I've got a vintage Ampeg B15 just behind the camera over there, and I just have it at a certain setting that works pretty well, and different basses in conjunction with the way you play will respond differently to EQ, but at least having a passing knowledge will help you. So the last tip is to do your research and listen. So find out what players used what basses and what techniques. For example, James Jamerson, he used old flat wounds that he hardly ever changed on an old P bass. I'm not saying you have to go and get a 62 P bass, which costs loads of money, but you can. For example, Fender does a custom shot pickup that's not that expensive. If you want to go for that tone, you might decide to get a cheap P bass, put that pickup in there, get some James Jamerson Labella heavy gauge flat wounds, and put foam mute there, and suddenly you're quite a lot closer to that technique. Carol Kay, she used flat wounds with a plectrum, and again she sometimes used a felt mute here. These are these old school sounds. You've got someone like Billy Gould, who I've been listening to a lot recently. Plectrum, stainless steel strings, and he uses some overdrive. So just be a bit of a detective when you're listening out for the tones that you like. You may just want to play one style, and that's absolutely fine. Or you may want to be a bit more like me. I do a lot of sessions, and I have to replicate lots of different styles. That's why I've got lots of different basses that can create a wide variety of tones. So know what your needs are, but I think it's just great to be a student of the bass and to listen out and figure out what's being used. You know, another player I really love is Tony Levin. He uses a 5-string and he uses compression a lot. And he uses compression in an interesting way. He'll often play really long notes, and just the tone on one note is amazing. And a lot of that reason, sometimes anyway, is down to the use of compression, where he'll play and the note will kind of sustain a bit. So, you know, it's a combination of just listening and also going on incredible forums like TalkBass, where you can find out. Don't get too obsessed, by the way, with pedals and gear. Just do what you can with what you've got. Just with some very simple techniques and a just well set up instrument and maybe a few pedals, you can recreate a whole variety of tones. You don't need a million different basses. However, if you want to play like Paul McCartney from the Beatles era, you probably will need a hollow body style bass. So just be able to hear the differences between different basses, pickups, and then that will guide you to where you want to go and to what gear to buy as well. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you got something from that. Any questions, let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, I'll see you on the next video.